Hi, and welcome to another episode of Real Talk Come Follow Me. Ganel-Lyn and I are so excited you guys are here. And I wanted to take just a minute. We got an email through our Siegel website from Muriel, and she said something that I just loved. And so we wanted to shout this out because if I could write what I hope people are getting, this is really what I think you and I would write. Yeah. And she wrote, I would like to tell Ganel-Lyn and Scott that my family and I really enjoy their weekly Come Follow Me videos. We discuss what we've learned as a family each Sunday morning and then watch their video. We love their insights and stories. It's perfect for my kids, not too long, with humor and spiritual discussions that they can understand. Thank you. So thank you. That was such a beautiful message.
And we try to keep them concise, but we're going to need prayers for today, right?
Yeah, 10 chapters.
10 chapters. And we appreciate that these episodes are doable for you to watch as the viewer, but we also pray that we're saying what is the most helpful to your discussions.
Yeah, so as we go through this, we're definitely going to, these are the beginnings of the war chapters, Alma 43 through 52, which is titled Stand Fast in the Faith of Christ. But we're going to this one's going to be a little bit of a scatter shot, if that's the right way of saying it, where we're just going to kind of jump around a little bit. So hopefully we'll show you some patterns and themes, maybe a framework to look at the war chapters that will be useful for you.
Right, we're really trying to show how to liken for your own personal wars. So we're going to take you through that pattern to break the scriptures down in a way that hopefully will be helpful. These chapters 43 through 62, are 17 years of war. And 68 chapters are wars, but not as many wars.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting to note, though, that 6 to 9 months are over 170 pages. So as you're going through this, it's really a growing season. And I think when we're living life, it can feel that way too. Almost as if when you're fighting a war, time slows way down sometimes. Yeah. And you're like, I don't know, is 2020 ever going to end?
Is it ever going to end? It's, August.
Right. So Alma 43, right away, Alma is not feeling peace. He's at unrest. He's feeling this sadness about the political unrest, the pride he's seeing. Wars are being rumored about on the horizon, and his only hope is to help his people. And so he decides the best way he can help them is go out and preach, because he's decided, as you read in Alma 31:5, is that correct?
Yeah.
That the word is more effective than the sword. And so this is such an empowering set of scriptures for me, because we really are at Real Talk trying to always piece out and piece apart wars that we're fighting individually. Yeah. And right now, I feel like I can relate to Alma looking at the headlines, that there's a lot to make us not feel restful in our souls.
And this has been, the war chapters have maybe been the most emotional part of the Book of Mormon for me on an individual level. I have switched the way I read the war chapters, and it was totally spirit-directed at a time where I needed it. I don't look at the war chapters, again, we've talked about this before. Don't look at yourself as Nephi and your siblings as laymen. Look at yourself as having both Nephi and layman tendencies, and where are you on the continuum with that? It's the same thing here. Rather than being like us against them, me versus you, this person against that person, we all have these Lamanite Nephite battles in our minds. And when that clicked for me, it made a huge difference, because if the Book of Mormon's written for our day, and this day is marked by men's hearts shall fail them, and that there's anger and we have all of this frustration, depression, and anxiety, hopelessness, like so much of what goes on in our day, the signs of the times tell us it's a depressing time to live, even though there's still hope. But make no mistake, it's going to be hard. Why doesn't the Book of Mormon address mental affliction? Why doesn't it address, I feel suicidal more often than I would like to admit? Why doesn't it, addiction and eating disorders and chronic illness and learning disabilities and loneliness, anger, and all of these things that we all wrestle with, and sometimes, like me, to our detriment silently. The war chapters to me are less about battlefields on earth, and they're more about battlefields of the mind.
I agree.
And so let me give you just a couple of things that I've gone through. Now I could go through this all day. I've got a bunch of these, but I don't want to overwhelm you. So just pick one or two, but I want to give you an idea. So I'll kind of interject some of these as we go. But let me give you one of them to start off with. Alma 43, 23 to 24. It says that Moroni, also knowing of the prophecies of Alma, he sent certain men to the prophet. desiring him that he should inquire of the Lord whether the armies of the Nephites should go to defend themselves against the Lamanites. And it came to pass that the word of the Lord came to Alma, and Alma informed the messengers of Moroni. So Moroni, taking part in, okay, what's the prophet doing and how can I incorporate prophetic teachings into my battles? So what to seek after? The prophet's words. What to seek after? General conference. So I've made a habit to make conference talks at least a weekly part, and sometimes when I'm really struggling with depression and anxiety, a daily part of my life, even if it's a 5-minute snippet of a talk.
So you first identified in that verse something that is maybe a detriment or a struggle for you, and then you identify what you're going to seek after.
Yeah, so what I'm going to seek after is the words of the prophet. And then what to stay away from, then I think of the opposite, wasting my time on things that don't serve me or inspire me. And when I'm in a depressive anxiety mode, the news can really...
You can't afford it.
It's hard. It's like throwing a drowning victim a rock. Like, it's so not useful. I need a life jacket. I don't need a rock.
I appreciate that.
And so that's one example of when you're in crisis mode, start to incorporate prophetic teachings.
I appreciate that pattern as well. And I've tried to kind of use these ward chapters and the pattern of addressing where I'm feeling vulnerable.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's in relationships, sometimes that's with my help, like you identified. And the pattern I've kind of seen is, where do I need to prepare? And then where do I need to fortify? But also, where do I need to know my enemy? And I think when you talk about a war, it's super helpful to understand how your enemy is going to react, and then you can plan around that. And oftentimes we in the church are like, should we be talking about Satan? Or as I like to call him, the guy with no body. I don't know why I like to call him that, but I have one and he doesn't.
Yeah.
Nana nana.
Yeah.
And then when I know he does the same thing, I've noticed that as I get good at knowing where he's putting on a whiteboard a plan to take me out that day, I've learned to fortify in those areas. And then he oftentimes will come up with a new plan and try to get in a back door or find a new approach to discouragement or putting a wedge in relationships. So one of the awarenesses I've had is that he uses distraction for me. And he can distract me with really good things, and he can distract me with things that are not useful for me, like you mentioned with the news. That's not helpful to you. And it makes me think of President Nelson's invitation. One of my most favorite talks in October 2019 was Spiritual Treasures.
Yes.
And he was bold. And I just recently revisited this talk, and I thought, here we are less than a year later. And in this talk, President Nelson was bold with the women of the church and the young women, and he asked us to address where we're being distracted, because we needed to learn this fortification and how to more likely hear God over all the distractions. And he said, part of this endeavor will require you to put aside many things of this world. And he goes on to say, the Holy Ghost will prompt you about what is no longer needful and what is no longer worthy of your time and energy. And he goes on to say, as we shift our focus away from these worldly distractions, some of the things that used to feel important may fall away. And that some of the things that we thought were harmless may not feel so harmless. And that through doing that, consecrating our lives, the Lord can change us and change our perspectives and feelings and give us spiritual strength. Wow. Less than a year later, I feel like I hear the prophet asking me to do that almost every day, because there's so much on the news or on my phone or in my life that can easily pull me away. And so that's one way I try to see, how can I prepare that day to avoid the distraction? And if I get up and I first have my divine appointment time, then I'm less likely to not get back to it. And if I don't find that that's a habit, then taking this pattern, I try to fortify. What can I do to build in the habit or not leave my room and start the to-do list? Because those are all good things. The things I'm trying to do are not bad things. I'm trying to take care of my family, but it can distract me from those divine appointments. So that's one example. He goes on to say another one. Do you want me to talk about this one?
Yes, please.
Do you want to do any other?
Well, all I was going to say is I appreciate you bringing up another dimension of this, because sometimes we're just fighting ourselves. Right? We feel that way, like we're kind of at a battle with certain struggles that we have. A learning disability can be really difficult to just be like, gosh, I have to deal with this forever, like for the rest of my life. And how do I manage that in a productive way where it doesn't drag me down and make me feel hopeless? But knowing that Satan, that we can often be like, yeah, but some of this is not my doing. Some of it is there is someone who really does actually want to throw me a stone when I'm drowning.
Right.
And laugh while I'm drowning. And so there is someone out there that really is interested in our destruction.
I visualize that the adversary has a team as well as God has a team, and that they have planning meetings, right? And so when youth are out there saying, I want to spend some time in the scriptures longer today, don't be surprised if the next day the adversary is like, oh no.
Yeah.
No, you're not going to hear God more than the distraction. Use your phone more today. Don't spend time talking to God. And so I just have found it helpful to know that there is an enemy. We're going to win the war, not to ruin the end of the story for everybody, but we will. The other invitation that I thought was so powerful, and you and I were discussing this, that President Nelson talked about, is that Satan and his minions will constantly contrive roadblocks to prevent women specifically, he's talking here, from understanding our spiritual gifts. The prophet goes on to say that it grieves him. And I just felt so grateful that he was so tender. This is the talk where, if you remember, he says, if you want a grandpa, I'm open for the job, and like all the women and young women were like, yes, we want you. But he says, it grieves me to think that any of you have felt marginalized or have not been believed by a priesthood leader or have been abused or betrayed by a husband, father, or supposed friend. I feel deep sorrow that any of you have felt sidelined, disrespected, or misjudged. Such offenses have no place in the kingdom of God. I apologize for my emotion, but to have a prophet of God boldly call out in such a validating tone for women and really identify that that is one of Satan's tools, right? That if he can remove women from conversations in ward councils or in gospel study or in corporate boardrooms, then he's winning. And so as women, I think we have a prophet on earth today who's calling that out and giving us permission to identify that in our war, to really show up and know our spiritual gifts and share them.
And I look at this, if I can, from my side, as not having the same experience that you've had, but I have a wife who has as well, and I've listened, and as you get emotional, it makes me think of the time she's been really emotional at night about this very thing, about being marginalized, and all of those words. It's like a checkbox of concerns that she's had, and this quote especially has caused me to think, like, has Satan ever used me to be that roadblock, to marginalize a voice in ward council or in some other setting at work or in any other way? I think of Martin Harris when he lost the 116 pages. It seems at that time that Joseph was he had created healthy boundaries with Satan. Like, he had been able to get him enough away where he could do, what he needed to do. So what does Satan do? He uses his friends. For the rest of Joseph's life, his battle is with these other people trying to be used as roadblocks for the restoration. And I think about this, for me, as I've got to be very careful not to be a roadblock. And then number two, then how can I be a facilitator of the gifts?
Well, I appreciate you, Scott, especially on this platform. I feel like one of our big whys when we started talking about doing this show was that from the optics, it would look like a different discussion between a man and a woman. And I have felt your respect. And I think as you were talking, what a powerful opportunity to say nothing else about this week's 10 chapters. But if the men in the world would stop and say, hey, on Real Talk, I heard this quote from President Nelson, have you, to the women in their lives, daughters, wives, mothers, sisters, have you ever felt marginalized? I promise you, men, if you say nothing else but that, it will feel validating to have that conversation. And you've always been willing to have that conversation with me, so thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. Like I said, I'm married to someone who's been through similar experiences, and it crushes my soul sometimes. Like, we just lay in bed and weep.
Well, I mean, the pattern for these chapters is a war, and what a beautiful image to think that the team gets bigger, right? Yeah. That the men and the women join together on fighting this specific attack from the adversary to quiet women's voices, whether it's at church, in our homes, or in our workplaces. So thank you for having that conversation.
Well, in light of that, Ganel-Lyn, why don't you talk a little bit about Lehantai? You were fired up about him, and I loved your take on talking about Alma 47 and Amalickiah and how he is such a type for the adversary and his relationship with Lehantai.
So if your 10-year-old boys and girls have gotten bored with Come Follow Me,
Yeah.
Get ready.
Yeah.
Like if they don't get excited about this story, and I've said this when we talked about Queen Lamoni and Abish, I was pretty excited. This is probably second to that story. And it's because, like we've been discussing today, you really identify the patterns of the adversary. And as you see the story of, say it for me.
Amalekiah.
Scott said it wrong, and now it's in my head wrong.
Yeah, Amalekiah.
Just to trick me.
Yep.
Yes, and Lahantai. They're in this drama, and it's upon a mountain, and it's an amazing example of how dark it can get. When someone's a believer and then they fall, what efforts they'll go to get their power back and to gain more power. For me, I learn about Satan from this. For example, there's a sense of false safety when he says you can come with your guards.
Yeah.
And how often does the adversary say that? I've used this with my teenagers. Like, oh, Mom, it's fine. This party's fine because my friends are going to be there. And oftentimes I'll say, but if you go inside your heart, how do you feel about being there? Because Satan will make us feel this false sense of security if we have friends. He also does a degree of poisoning. This is a poisoning story, right?
Poisoning by degrees.
By degrees. Whoa. And I shared with you in our preparation for today that this is exactly what Satan does to me. He doesn't say, you know what, you should quit everything. He just gives me little degrees of poison, of self-doubt, to the point that I get sick and I'm incapacitated.
And shame, as we talked about last time, shame is a poison by degrees voice.
Right. The manipulation in this story and mapping it out would be super helpful because it's so layered. By degrees, he's poisoned, and then eventually he has power, and he kills the king. Once he has the power, he uses propaganda. Verse 17 through 19 of 47 is interesting, where he talks about how the chief leader was killed to appoint the second leader to be the chief leader. Like, mapping it out would be a really helpful exercise, and I think it would create an enthusiasm. The scriptures are not boring, and this is an example. This story, for me, tells me so much about the enemy and how he tries to attack us at varying degrees of poisoning.
Yeah, and so let me finish with one last one from a mental affliction standpoint that has been really useful for me, and that's Alma 48:7. And this is really where this whole mindset all began for me, of reading the war chapters in context of my mental battles that I deal with. And it says, and now it came to pass that while Amalekiah had thus been obtaining power by fraud and deceit that you just articulated, Moroni, on the other hand, had been preparing the minds of the people to be faithful unto the Lord their God. Two very different ways of getting power. And so for me, this is preparing my mind. This was a call for me to get a therapist when I really needed one, and I was resistant to it because I felt like it was an admission that I was just too weak, that I was worthless, and it was the exact opposite. Therapy has been a huge blessing. And if I can add one more, we just, along with this, about preparing your mind, and that has been positive affirmations. And we watched The Help with our kids the other day.
That's a painfully great movie.
Oh, it is. It is. And
right?
One of the things that there's a positive affirmation that one of these women who's taking care of a black woman, taking care of a white child, she always has this girl say these affirmations, which is, you is smart, you is kind, and you is important. And the reason why I bring that up is affirmations and therapy have saved me from going into some self-destructive behaviors that don't serve me. And so anyways, you go through the war chapters, identify a battle that you're fighting with, that you need help with, and maybe some of these verses can be extremely useful. To me, the war chapters are a form of scriptural therapy.
And it shows us where we need to fortify. Maybe like in 51, you need to see where there's some lack of unity in your home or in your workplace, where that's your weak spot. That's where adversaries getting in. For you, I love any shout out for therapy, I think is important, because as much as I feel like we talk about it, I still hear from people that have the same fear that somehow it's giving up or it's their weakness. And I always see is that's a fortification tool, and that is allowing someone to check how you're thinking inside to make sure it's in line with really what God feels about Scott and me.
My therapists have been my angels, honestly.
I love that. Thank you for joining us today. Please identify one simple prompting maybe that you've had This is 10 chapters where you're able to see how you're fighting a battle and where you need the fortification. Hopefully we've shared some ideas, whether it's therapy, whether it's going to a spouse or a friend and saying, I'm struggling here. I had a prompting this week. I know this is my battle. This eating disorder is getting to me. This learning disability is taking me out. Can you help me see where maybe I can be fortified in this? And don't be afraid of calling out the enemy this week. Make sure he knows you know that you're onto him and that he's wanting to take you out. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for liking and subscribing. We really hope, especially this week, that you'll share this episode. There are a lot of people fighting at every level, and they may need to hear this episode this week for permission to go to therapy or to get the extra help that they need.